Okay, great. I am going to share my screen, and then I'm going to give a couple of heads up, and then we are going to start. Yes. Can you give me host rights to share screen?
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, you should
Okay.
begin.
Yes. Thank you. Um, you should see my entire screen, right?
Yeah, you're
Can
all
some, yeah, thanks. Um, how do I, sorry, thank you. Okay, so I'm Velina. I am going to talk about being strategic and dynamic. And I think it's worst if I assume that you know me. So I'm just going to introduce myself. Um, Hi, I have been doing debating for seriously for about like 3.5 years, but I have been involved in debating and known about debating for around 5 years. Um, Through this time, I have been part of the Bulgarian Debate Association and the Bulgarian Debate Society. And later, after my WSEC years, I joined the Sofia University Club, and I have been competing under Sofia ever since. Um, with my partner, we have broken at Worlds and we have won Euros Open, and I'm currently the upcoming CA of the upcoming Euros, not this one, the next one. So I probably have some expertise and knowledge that could be useful to you. This is about myself. Um, about generally what this workshop is going to be about and how should you approach this workshop. It's going to be generally about strategy, misconceptions of strategy, what is strategy, how to be more strategic in debating, and thus more dynamic. How should you approach this? Honestly, I don't think most of you will remember more than 1 to 2 things out of this workshop. And this is not because of you and your specific capabilities, it's just because of human memory. I don't remember most of the workshops I have listened to, and I don't think that if you look back on workshops that you have attended previously, you probably have a very similar experience to me. So the key takeaways that you should have, I will say, in the like conclusion of this workshop and try to focus on them. I will give a lot of examples, but you don't need to remember every single example. So don't over focus on every tiny specific detail that I'm saying. And also, if you know a bit of the things that I'm already talking about, maybe don't focus on remembering them, but focus on remembering what is new to you, what you find interesting. And here, a second disclaimer comes into part. I think debating is very specific to each individual person. And most of what I'm going to now give you as a presentation is something that I have come up myself with. I have thought about debating a lot. I have experimented with a lot of different arguments, and I have found different like components or structures within how I come up with arguments, for example, what is considered strategic and what is not considered strategic. And I think that most of you have probably also come up with your own kind of system of debating, system of coming up with reasons. And don't take everything that I say as like the word of God, and this is what you should do. More so, take it as a starting point for you to think about debating and for you to kind of try to understand what I'm talking about, because I'm not going to be so clear 100% of the time, or you're not going to completely understand what I'm saying 100% of the time, because just we perceive debating from different standpoints. So kind of try to think about what I'm saying on your own afterwards and try to come up with how it's actually going to be implementable in your own speeches, in your own way of thinking about debating. So those were the two disclaimers. Oh no, there is a third one. Interact. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Please try to answer them. The more you interact, the better you're going to remember this, because that's how your brain works. If you're engaged in also talking and not only listening, it's going to be more comprehensive for you. Okay, now we are going to start with a couple of misconceptions that we have about strategy. Firstly, strategy is not about AD chess. It's not like incredibly counterintuitive, and it's not about thinking of all the possible little things that can happen within a debate. Strategy is kind of straightforward, and I'm going to talk about it a bit later. Strategy is also not about soft propping motions and not about thinking of the most exclusive counter props or the most comprehensive models that you can think of on policy motions, trying to outframe most of the opposition through this model, or trying to counter prop the most strategic counter prop you can think of from opposition. It's kind of not about bending the motion. Strategy is kind of exactly the opposite. It is debating the motion. So I think a lot of the intuitions that when we are talking about strategy is, oh, how can I make my argument unbeatable? That's not what strategy is. Strategy is choosing the right argument to run and running it in a matter that will win the debate. It's not about trying to change the motion or trying to circumvent the motion or circumvent and escape the clash. And lastly, and this has been like a downward trend, I think, from 2022 onwards. I think in 2022, probably it was very popular, but it's kind of not now. It's not about outframing the debate. It's not standing up from bottom half saying everything top half said is irrelevant. It's probably not. So that's also not what strategy is. Now that we have a more general conception of what is not strategy, let's talk about what strategy is. We have two different types of strategies. And again, this is what I have thought about myself. So it's not like a clear-cut separation. It's macro strategy, which is choosing the right argument to run and identifying the clashes that exist within a debate. So you're better prepared for what the other side of the debate will run. And it's also micro strategy, which is about identifying the burdens that you need to prove within a case, identifying what's the most important burden that you need to put most proof in, and also thinking about how the analysis that you are mechanizing this case with could be the most strategic that could be. Meaning, how can you prove the case in a way that it's harder to rebut? How can you prove the case in a manner that's most time efficient so you don't spend time on things that are irrelevant within the debate? So the general separation is, again, macro strategy is just the general things within a debate. What is your case? What are the clashes? This is about the bigger things. And micro strategy is about the smaller things, about the burdens, about the analysis, about the mechanization. Yes, so this is the large separation that I'm going to talk about within this workshop. Going on to content generation. How do you generate content? This is like an open question. And firstly, I'm going to make a trial for myself, and then I'm going to give the floor to you to just kind of explain to me how you generate content. For example, if I have the motion, which is, I think, from Black CUDC, this house believes that news publications should be anonymized and signed as a collective editorial. This doesn't seem like the most high impact motion. And when it's not the most high impact motion, it's very unclear what the arguments are, because right, if it's high impact, then you know the impacts, then this is a starting point for the arguments that you're going to think about. And when it's not the most high impact, it's kind of harder and you start to struggle about what arguments are there. And if I think about the motion, this house believes news publication should be anonymized and signed off as a collective editorial, I am thinking about, firstly, an argument that affects news publications themselves. Does anything change about their structure, how they promote people, how they're liable from other organizations, how specifically people are going to reach out as sources and provide them information about news that they're going to generate? So when I think about this specific motion, I'm thinking about all the different actors that play a role in news publication, maybe the government as well. Does the government regulate news sites more or less under this motion? And this is, for me, the starting point of thinking of arguments in this specific motion, since it's not that high of an impact. Let's try it with you. If the motion is this house prefers the quality of art being viewed as predominantly subjective as opposed to predominantly objective, what are the different arguments that you can think of on prop, for example?
I think you can talk about like what kind of art would be sold at, like galleries and like how much can you make it sell for more? And then you can mechanize depending on like, oh, if it's like subjective, then like more people are going to, you can sell it to more people, so like more audience for art, etc. So I think that's one of the possibilities.
Okay, so we have one argument, which is when it's viewed as predominantly subjective, more art will be sold. This is one argument. Can we think of a second argument?
So we can explain how individual derive fulfillment from that art when there is an objective standard of a certain art. So we define that you should view that art in a certain way, but when this is going to be subjective, individual can relate with those art with their own stories, with their life stories, or like with the perception which they went through in their life. So individual can derive better fulfillment from art.
Okay, so we have an argument that is more so about selling art, and then we have an argument about the individual's fulfillment about art. There is, I think, another argument that's in the comments, the ways artists view and engage with their own art being less overly critical comparing themselves to others. This is a third argument, which is an argument for artists. Can we think of a fourth one?
Probably you can say that it leads to, am I audible?
Oh, yes, you are.
So another argument we could say is that this leads to more diverse artists entering the career and also getting success in the career.
Yes, we probably can talk about minorities and whether minority art will be put on a pedestal or not so when art is viewed as predominantly subjective. Saying it in different words than you and saying it in more different words than you, what is the standard of objectiveness? Who is putting this standard? And is this excluding minorities in a moment that we are putting the label of objective art versus subjective art? Okay, then we have generally four arguments. One about how much art is sold, the second is about the individuals, the third is about whether how artists themselves feel, and the fourth one is about what are those artists entering the field. Okay, I think you have a generally similar idea, like me, which was to say identifying different aspects of the motions, different actors in the motions, and trying to derive an argument from there. For example, we have an argument kind of on galleries. This is an actor, which are selling the art. So we have an impact upon them. They're going to sell more art. We have an actor, which is the individuals that are buying art, deriving more like fulfillment from the art. This is the argument that we can think about when we think about the individuals. We also have the artist as actors within the motion. What is the harm or like benefit upon them? Are they more critical to themselves? Are they creating better art? Are they more fulfilled under this motion? And the fourth one is, what are those actors in the first place? Are they from minority backgrounds? Can they succeed when they're from minority backgrounds? So kind of you identify the different actors within the motion and you try to work away from there. So when you generate content, there are probably three different methods that you can use, and there are probably many more methods. It's just those three, I think, are very comprehensive and straightforward. The first one that I think all of us utilized until now is the actor-oriented, which is think of all the possible actors in the motion and the motion effects. For example, with the art motion, it was the galleries. Probably there is an argument about the government and on which side of the house the government gives more funding to art. We have an argument upon artists. We have an argument about people buying the art, and we have what types of artists are succeeding. So if we think about all the actors within the motion, we can probably derive an argument from every single one of them. And after we have thought about what are the actors, we can try to think about how this change that the motion is proposing affects them. Because all motions are about change, right? On one side of the house, there is subjective art. The other side of the house is objective art. So there is change within the motion. So we're trying to think how this specific change affects these actors. And here I want to note, not all of the arguments that you think about are going to be great, especially if you go about the actor-oriented method, because not all actors are incredibly relevant, or not all actors are going to be affected to the same degree from the change that is happening within the motion. But it is a good starting point to try to move your brain so you can think about more things. The second method that you can utilize is the method-oriented content generation. What do I mean by method-oriented? Is think about how the motion works. It's notice the difference between the workings of the motion in the status quo and the proposed change. And this is mostly for policy motions, and I'm going to get to it in a second. But this is mostly about policy motions where there is actual policy that is executed by different individuals. So you're thinking about in every step of the way, how is this process executed and what is the change of this process and what can this process generate as an impact or as an argument. And think about an impact derived from that change of process, whether the first part of the process can make an argument, whether the second part of the process argument. And again, this, if it's kind of fuzzy in your mind as I'm saying it now, it will become a little bit more clear in a second when I give an example. And the third way to generate an argument is, of course, the clash-oriented generation. I think most of you have probably been told by your coaches, okay, think about the clashes within this debate and try to think of an argument deriving from those clashes. And that is the clash-oriented method. It's not much more than that. It's just trying to identify the clashes within the motion and trying to think of an argument that can potentially win this clash. Going on to a bit more detail of every one of those methods. Going on to the actor-oriented method, I think this one we kind of already did a bit because of both of the examples that I already said, both the editorial and the journalist motion and the art motion are about actors, but I'm going to just proceed with this one because I think it's kind of important and it's a good way to think about quantity of arguments if you want that from prep. If the motion is this house believes that news publications should be anonymized and signed as a collective editorial, we already talked about it. If we identify the government, the organizations themselves, the editors, the journalists, the people that come forward with evidence, and probably the readers, we have 6 different groups that this motion kind of touches upon. If we try really hard, we'll probably find an argument on each of those 6 groups. If it's the government, it's whether the government is going to regulate news editorials more or less under this motion. If it's about the editorials themselves, we can think about what is the structure based on which they're going to promote journalists within the organization. Does that structure change in a moment that it's going to be anonymized and signed off as a collective editorial? Or are they, in what ways are they liable in a moment that this motion is implemented? And is this good or bad for them? If we talk about the editors, I think the argument about liability definitely falls upon them. If we talk about the different journalists, we can talk about how specifically responsibly are they approaching all of the news that they are writing now. Are they going to be more fact-checking or less fact-checking because they're like kind of relying upon the whole organization? If we talk about the people that are coming forward with evidence, do they feel more or less secure in a moment that the organization signs off as a collective editorial and they cannot track down the individual journalists that took in their information? Or do they feel less protected because there is no accountability on the journalists themselves? And fifthly, about the people who are reading these news like outlets, do they trust them more? Do they prefer this type of content? Again, not every single one of those arguments is going to be the debate-winning argument, but it's a great starting point to think of a quantity of arguments if that is something that you're lacking in prep. And here, I was not incredibly clear as to why we're doing this activity. Strategy is about identifying the right argument. You cannot identify the right argument if you cannot think of enough of a quantity of arguments that you can choose from and you can compare between. And this is why content generation lies at the base of strategy. Okay, let's try actor-oriented content generation with the motion. Yes, we already did it. I think you identified 4 different arguments that are connected with different actors, and that is probably sufficient. And you get the idea, right? So we can move on. I think we talked about this one enough, and I feel from the responses I got from the beginning, you kind of understand it.
Yep.
Yes? Okay. Great. Going on to method-oriented content generation. For example, if we take another Black Sea motion, it's just easy for me to give examples from Black Sea. This house would grant substantial authority to esport player unions, including but not limited to influence over tournament format, in-game balance, and working conditions. If we're thinking about this motion and we're trying to identify the different arguments that it has, maybe it's a better idea to think about the method of how are we going to grant this substantial authority. And if we are trying to think about the method, we are kind of trying to think about what happens in real life. And then a lot of questions pop up. Who is this organization that is going to grant this substantial authority? This is the first question that would pop in my mind. Is this the centralized league, or are those the different leagues that exist in esports? Is there like a centralized body? Are they decentralized? Who is giving those player unions the authority? Secondly, what is this authority? To what extent do they have authority in the status quo? How much more authority are they getting? The third question is, do esports player unions exist on both sides of the house? This is not something that I have heard about before this motion, so it's interesting to explore whether they exist in the first place. And if they do, to what extent do they exist? Are they a popular thing? And my intuition is, when I have not heard about them, that they're probably not that popular. And thus, on the side of the house where they have substantially more authority, will they be more popular? Thus, will more of them exist? And the fourth question afterwards is, are esports players unions actually good? Do they generate good outcomes for both the player themselves and the community, the gaming community behind them? So when I'm thinking about the method-oriented method, and this is, I know I mentioned method twice, I am thinking about all the different steps of this working in real life. So I'm thinking about the method, I'm thinking about the process. And probably all of those different steps are going to give me a hint of how this motion works, so I can lead myself in the direction of content generation. And probably, not always, but most of those questions that I'm asking myself of how this is working are going to lead me to generate an argument. For example, if I'm thinking about to what extent they have authority now and how much more authority are they going to get, from proposition, I can say they do not have enough authority. Players are underrepresented. Now, when they have substantially more authority, this is a good thing. But on opposition, I can say they have enough authority currently in the status quo. Granting them substantial authority is going to lead leagues in a worse position, where certain clubs that are in more privileged positions than others, because they have been dominating the league for quite some time now, are going to be the ones deciding how the league is going to be, which is not great. Or them having substantial authority will lead to changes in the games that are not going to be great for the average player of the game. So this is a bad thing. So when I ask myself, okay, to what extent they already have authority, and is this authority sufficient? Because I have asked myself of the process of this motion, then I can probably derive arguments for both sides. I hope that was clear, but we are going to understand in a second. If we have the motion, this house will give every citizen a positive and a negative vote in elections. What is the process? What is the method that you need to think about in this motion?
Like one of the processes that we can talk about is like political campaigning, how that is done, and
Great.
how politicians, like, do they motivate people like to positive vote for themselves or like negative vote for like their opponents, and like derive impacts from there?
Yeah, that's a great starting point to think about. Okay, this is probably going to lead to changes in campaigning. What are those changes? Are those changes positive, negative? And you can probably prove both, by the way. Besides that, what other processes can we think of when looking at this motion?
Think of like the actual voting day. Like, what's the actual difference between this system and single transferable vote, of like you like rank them, and why it's important for people to have negative vote towards certain candidates, or who would they think to put negative votes to on that day?
Yeah, that's also a great starting point. I heard the second voice.
Yeah, so something quite similar to that, but I think there's just something about will the process of voting, and like will people be able to understand it, like given that like often people are disenfranchised. Like there's probably something around like participation in the process.
Yeah, can they understand it is also a great starting point. No, we don't want to go back. It's just very hard for me to open the chat. Yes, because I see how to determine the seats per positive vote. What happens to parties overall more negative votes? Yes, those are like questions about the process of this motion and how this motion is working, which will kind of shift the debate in significantly different ways when you're starting to think about them, right? Because if you say this party had so many votes, but they also had so many negative votes, is the negative vote the same amount as the positive vote, meaning that if they had the equal amount positive and negative votes, they're not entering parliament? Or does this just take away a bit of their seats? Do you want me to read stuff out, Velina? What do you mean about that?
If you just can't read the chat, I can read stuff out.
No, it's fine, it's fine. It's okay. It's just hard for me to find the button. It's fine. Is it likely for people who are currently politically apathetic only to use negative votes? Yes, this is also an argument. So you're thinking about all the small things that this motion will change. And as you can see, there are already so many different directions in which you can go. And there are probably so many different arguments that you can find out. Just from thinking about what are the processes, how do those processes change? Does it affect other incentives / abilities of political parties or people? And they're probably, I think this motion is quite deep if you start to think about it this way. But if I give it, for example, to my WSDC kids, they think it's quite shallow because they don't start thinking about the different processes that take place. And they only have a debate about, okay, which parties are going to enter parliament. Only on the basis of how many positive / negative votes are they going to have. But if they think about the whole process holistically, they're probably going to have an argument about campaigning and how campaigning changes, or an argument about smaller parties and are they going to enter parliament, or an argument about the general workings of the system and whether it's going to be actually implementable in a non-corrupt manner, because this is also an argument because it doesn't say Western liberal democracies. Do we have questions upon this?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
With content generation and prep time, how much time should we spend doing this exercise in general?
Yes. So I think there are two things to this. The first one is content generation on its own could be trained separately from prep. And I think this is something that you should do. I think you can train content generation generally outside of prep for like 5 minutes. You give yourself 5 minutes, one side of the motion, and you try to think about as many arguments as you can possibly think of. And I think this is where all of those methods you can implement. And this you can do a couple of times, you can do once per day, or all of those different things. Because at the end of the day, you cannot spend so much time in prep thinking about, okay, so Velina in that one workshop said that I should think about arguments this way. What did she say exactly? And then to try to think about what I said and then to try to think of an argument. I think that takes away too much time. I think in prep, it's good to have already prepared with separate training, because then it's much more intuitive and it comes kind of like a striking from God or from like the clouds what argument you should run, because it's already like a reflex that you have if you have trained about it separately. But if you're asking just about prep, how much time you should take for arguments, I think each motion depends. The most I will take out of prep is 3 minutes. The general scenario I take out of prep is half a minute to a minute. It depends on the motion and how confused I am by the motion. And it also depends on how much time you took outside of prep to actually train this. So my advice is, and after I'm done with this whole section, this was going to be my advice on what to do in order to actually implement this. Try a couple of times to generate content in each of those categories through each of those methods and see what feels best for you and try to develop a reflex for it so you can actually do it in prep and it's not going to be stressful and it's not going to be something that actually makes you worse than you already makes you worse than you would have been on the comparative if you didn't do it. Yeah. Okay.
Quick question. Could you please quickly show the first slide with all 3 methods just for a second?
Yeah. I am also going to share the slides immediately after this. Yeah, I'm going to go now. I assume you have screenshot.
Yeah, thanks.
No problem. Okay. We now have clash-oriented method. And again, this is quite straightforward. You think about the clashes and you try to derive arguments from them. For example, in disaster-prone areas, this house would replace all state rebuilding and construction efforts with direct cash transfers to affected citizens. This is, I think, around 1 Belgrade world. Here, the clashes, I think, are quite straightforward. On which side of the house the government is going to give more money, on which side of the house this money is going to be more helpful for the people on ground, short term, and on which side of the house the government, like this money is going to be more effective for people in the long term. And I think given all those three clashes, then you can derive arguments from all of them. On the clash, where is the government going to give more money? Maybe I did not phrase this correctly, but there could be arguments about is like state rebuilding and reconstruction efforts harder to like corrupt and to steal away from, or are direct cash transfers? And that might sound like an intuitive argument, but this is kind of also why we are doing this. So you can think of an intuitive argument, but for me, living in a not the most uncorrupt state, this is probably a thing to think about when we are talking about this motion. The second is, which will be more helpful short term? Probably the side that is saying direct cash will be more helpful short term, but you could also probably try to think of arguments about on proposition how this is going to be more helpful short term. For example, you can say many of those people with direct cash transfers still cannot move away from the city. So for them, it's much more helpful in the short term to have the road built back so they can get food, or they can get some type of construction material so they can build back their house, as opposed to having money that they cannot spend. This is an argument that you can do from prop on the clash. This is going to help a lot of people in the short term. And because I have thought of this clash of people helping in the short term, I can derive an argument that I wouldn't have gone for immediately in prep if I had not thought about the clash. Because it's much more intuitive for me to go on proposition about the clash on the long term. That in the long term, having a hospital in this area again is probably something good. So thinking about the clashes will lead you to arguments that you probably intuitively you would not think of, but it's good to think of them because they might win the debate. And when you have thought about the clashes, you can probably derive at least one argument per side per clash. Let's try this. This house believes that environmental movement should take more radical actions in fighting against climate change, e.g. blocking roads, vandalism, blowing up pipelines. Generally, and this is like a rule, like social movements motions have 4 clashes. Let's try to identify those 4 clashes.
So the first one I think is like, do you lose people in terms of like masses, but you gain more like how you say concentrated people that are devoted to you, like to the movement, and like whether that's good or bad?
Yeah. So we have an argument about the following, and kind of how this clash, not an argument, a clash, gets decided is one side says we have more people following the movement, and the other side says we have less people, but they're more quality people. So it's kind of quality versus quantity, and we'll come back to that. So we have a clash about people. Do we have a second clash?
I just put that on the chat, but effect in passing policy.
Yes. On which side of the house are we going to be more effective in policy passing? This is another clash. Do we have a third one?
What
Okay.
happens internally in the movement?
Hmm?
Internally, what happens in the movement? Polarization or not?
Sure. This is an argument that could be run, I think, could be possibly run on both sides. I'm trying to think about whether this argument can be included in a general clash of efficiency. If we have a general clash about following, then we have a general clash of efficiency, which could be separated in policy efficiency, efficiency within the movement, and then efficiency in agenda. But it's still kind of the efficiency clash. So I'm still looking for 2 more clashes.
Wendy put some in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them. She
No,
said
sorry.
backlash funding participation.
Backlash, I think, falls into the first clash, which is about following. But I think there is another clash that is not mentioned until now, which is about funding. So we have generally in social movement motions, we always have following clash, we have funding clash, then we have efficiency clash. And the fourth one, and it's kind of an intuitive and it doesn't kick in all social movements motions, it's a principled clash on what the movement ought to do. I don't know whether somebody wrote this in the chat, and I'm sorry, it's very hard for me to track the chat. If you can say things audibly, it would be much better. Yes. So based on those 4 clashes, and I think it's kind of intuitive, you can think of arguments on both sides of the house. Like on the following clash, one side says you're going to have more people following the social movement. The other side says we have less, but they're more quality, and this is better. Funding, it's probably the same quality over quantity. More companies funding the movement, but more devoted and actually environmental conscious companies funding the movement on the other side of the house. On policy, we probably have a similar thing. On one side of the house, we have quantity. Again, it's most of those clashes are quantity over quality. In one side, you have more policy, for example, passed. It's just that this policy is going to be not weaker, but milder. On the other side, you're not going to have more than one policy passed, but this policy is going to be radical. So it's again quality over quantity. And on the principled clash, it's whether they should be more violent in their actions, given that we are destroying the planet, yada, yada. This is probably not the strongest argument. Again, this doesn't necessarily generate all of the best possible arguments for the debate. It just generates a lot of them. Yeah. Can you kindly repeat the third clash? The third clash is about funding. And no, the third clash, or at least the sequence that I said, was about efficiency and about whether policy is going to get passed. Yes, I'm not sure which one of them are you asking, because I said them in different sequences at different points in time. But I think somebody also answered you, so we are going to move on, because I have a lot of things to talk about, and I am realizing that I may have made a very long presentation for the time that I have. When to use what? Actor-oriented, as I already said in the beginning of this section, probably we use for low impact, ambiguous impact motions. Those are motions with art, journalism, IR, everything that you genuinely, after you sit and read about the motion, you're like, what is the delta? Then it's probably actor-oriented method is going to help you the most. Method-oriented, and I, again, already said this, are motions about policy that are complex, that have inherent comparisons within them, such as social movements motions, where there is process for you to think about, and in each step of the process you can derive an argument from. And then the clash-oriented, most basic motions will help you if you think about clash-oriented. Economics, IR, motions where this will be done well is part of the clash. And if you struggle, you can, of course, mix and match the methods to have at least 3 separate ideas in prep. This is the goal. Because if you have 3 separate ideas in prep, then you can actually think about, okay, which of those ideas best fits within the debate. And after we have those three ideas, then we come to the other question, which is which of those ideas to select, which argument is going to win in the debate. Because this is what strategy boils down to. What is winning? And we have here 2 different types of motions. And I know like the thing that you're seeing now probably looks like something that a crazy person wrote, but I promise it has like madness to the method. The first type of motion, the clashes that are within the motion are weighed inherently to one side of the house. For example, if we have proposition and opposition, there is probably a clash that proposition inherently, not inherently, but intuitively loses and opposition wins. and there is a clash that proposition intuitively wins and opposition loses. If we take the motion about in disaster-prone areas, this house will make infrastructure as opposed to direct cash transfers. If we think about this motion, again, the clash about short-term efficiency is probably a clash that proposition loses because roads take a long time to build, meaning that in the short term, people are not going to get the benefit from roads, but people are going to get the direct cash transfers. So in the short term, it's a lot more efficiency for opposition there from proposition. So this clash intuitively goes to op. In your intuition, not inherently, you can win the clash, but that's not the point. And the other clash, which is about the long-term sustainability, proposition says roads are really good for the long term. This is probably intuitively right. Direct cash is not that great for the long term. This is probably also intuitively right. So this clash goes intuitively to proposition. Most motions have clashes which are weighted to one side or the other. And they probably have one clash that goes to prop, one clash that goes to op. Maybe there are other clashes that go either way or are weighted to one side. Why is this good to identify? I'll speak in a second. I just want to make the comparison with the second types of motions, which there are clashes which both teams can run an argument which is equally winning the debate. Those are motions like social movements motions, as I already said, where there are identified couple of clashes within the debate about funding, about following, about efficiency. And those clashes could go to either side of the house. For example, with funding, you can say why you get more funding on one side of the house, but on the other, you can say we get more quality funding. With following, you can say we get more followers on our side of the house, but on the other, you can say we get more quality followers that are doing basically the same impact. So you're arguing about the same things. With the weight clashes, you're arguing about different things. One side is arguing about short term, the other about long term, and you're trying to weigh between short term and long term. But in the like motions that are with the same clashes, you're arguing about the same clash. You're trying to reach the same outcome because clashes are ultimately about impact. So you're trying to reach the same impact, but just in different ways, and you're arguing which way is the best one to reach the impact. Now going on a little bit more in detail for every, like for those two sections. The first one about weighted clashes. The example is, for example, this house believes that major tourist destinations should significantly limit the number of tourists that can visit. Proposition probably can say the argument, this will lead to a lot of, for example, not a lot of buildings are now going to be ruined. There is not going to be a lot of pollution. People are going to lead a little bit better lives within those areas because tourists don't exist there. And on the clash on preserving those destinations and having less pollution, this is a clash that intuitively goes to prop, right? Like on opposition, there is little to no argument that you can make that tourists don't pollute or they pollute disproportionately less than the local population. On opposition, you can make the clash, okay, but economy good, you know, tourism generates a lot of money for the economy. And this is probably a clash that is going to get weight towards opposition because proposition can make mitigation about the economy, can say you can develop in other things, but it intuitively goes to opposition that if this motion kicks in, then probably you're going to lose out money. So you have two different clashes, which if I'm on proposition, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to run the argument, which is intuitively winning me the clash on pollution, which opposition cannot contest that much. And I'm going to kind of ignore the clash about economics or try to mitigate it as much as I can. But I'm not trying to run a winning argument on the clash about economics. I'm trying to run the winning argument on the clash about pollution because that's a clash that I intuitively win. Why is this important? If you can identify whether the motion has weighted clashes, you can also identify the clash that you're intuitively winning if you prove it. And this is important insofar as this is probably the right argument that you should run, meaning this is the strategic argument that you should run. I'm not saying that if you run it, you're going to win the debate just like that. I'm saying that this is the first step to winning a debate. In weighted motions, after you have run the argument that wins you the clash that is weighted, what you need to do is weigh between the first clash and the second clash. So if I am to run on proposition the argument about pollution, the second thing I will do is weigh as to why pollution, for example, or perseverance of old buildings is comparatively more important than economics, because I have won one of the clashes and I'm just weighing against the other that opposition is going to win. This is the general strategy that exists within those types of motions. So the first part of like what I have been saying was think about the different arguments that exist. And if you can afterwards identify what type of motion it is, whether it has weighted clashes or it has the same like clashes, then you can identify the right argument to run and what is your strategy to winning. In weighted clashes motions, the strategy to winning is weighing, because you intuitively win one clash and you need to weigh it out against the other. Okay, then moving on to the second type of motion, which is symmetric clashes, mechanization and responses. What do I mean by this? I'll say in a second. In symmetric clashes, again, I told you we have the same clash. We are trying to get the same impact. We are just disagreeing on the method that is most efficient to get this impact. Again, another social movement motion is this house prefers leaderless movements. We are arguing on which side of the house are we going to get more policies passed. And proposition is going to propose one way of argumentation to reach this impact. Opposition is going to propose another way of argumentation to reach this impact. We are arguing on the same clash, on the same impact. Then the strategy that we are going to have is firstly, run the argument, no matter whether we intuitively think it's losing or not. Because if the motion is with symmetric clashes, then we need to contest this clash. So the first thing is running the argument. And the second thing is, you're not going to win this motion through weighing between clashes, because the clashes are symmetric. Not symmetric, but they could be won from both sides. The way to win this motion is to win the individual clash. Thus, you need to win on mechanization and you need to win on responses, because you're both trying to reach the same impact. So you need to discredit the way that they're reaching this impact. So you need responses towards their mechanization. And you also need to secure that you have reached this impact. So you need your mechanization to stand in place. And again, this is all about in prep. You have a lot of ideas. The way to just know which ideas to run is to identify what type of motion it is, whether it's weighted or it's symmetric. And if it's symmetric, try to run like the arguments upon the clashes that you think could be won on either side of the house, and then try to win those clashes through mechanization and responses. So again, the takeaway out of this is, firstly, you need to be able to generate a lot of arguments in order to identify the strategic ones. And the way to identify the strategic ones is by identifying what type of motion it is. And afterwards, the way to be the most strategic you can be is having a clear pathway to victory. Is it weighing with the other clash? Is it responding to the other argument? And again, this depends on kind of what type of motion it is. This can be a lot to take in. I also talk quite fast. So I'm going to wait for some questions if you have any. Yes, so this is the course. But before you start worrying about whether you need to weigh between clashes on those motions, you need to worry whether you're winning the clash. Because in the other type of motion, it doesn't matter whether you're like losing the clash that we intuitively lose. It just matters for you to win the clash that you're already winning. In those motions, it's very ambiguous whether you're winning or losing the clash. That's why it's incredibly important to engage with the other side and try to win the clash first. I am not saying that you should not weigh. I'm sorry, maybe that's how it sounded. You probably need to weigh, especially when there are like a couple of clashes and there is closing. I'm sorry, I just have been so used to teaching WSDC kids that I forgot that this is a thing. But yeah, so you firstly need to make sure that you're winning the clash on those types of motions. And then if you have the time, weigh. If you don't, this is still securing that you win at least the top half, which in my experience secures you at least the second. There is a question which I'm trying to get. Yes, second. What in situation when motion has both big symmetric clash and big weighted clash for each side? Then you probably need to do a bit of both. You probably need to engage in the clash that is symmetric and try to win this clash. And then if you have the time, it's not if you have the time, because if closing takes it, if you're opening, that's not the greatest. then just give the argument that you think is winning the weighted clash. So it's kind of doing a bit of both. It's not ideal, but what I will say is if you choose to do one of those things, it could also work for you. If you have won the big symmetric clash, and if you have explained as to why this is like a prerequisite to winning the whole debate, because it's a prerequisite to other clashes, or you have explained as to why this clash affects most people and the weighted clash does not affect as many people, then it's okay to just choose one or the other if you don't have that much time. But if you have that much time and you want to kind of fuck over closing, it's also good to do both things. And from closing, I promise opening will not engage in either one of the clashes, and then you'll probably have an extension. Yes. It's 26, and there is another workshop that's supposed to begin in 20 minutes, right? Bart, this is a question to you.
Yes, at 1:45, but don't worry because some people have been going 5 minutes over, and that's fine if you want to.
Yeah, no, I am halfway through. That's the problem. I'm thinking of how to structure it, so it's most efficient.
I can quickly message Zarina because we don't have a third session today, so I can check what her.
No. What we can do is I can just talk about what is most important from the second half. I think the first half is way more important than strategy. I think the second part, which is about burden identification and analysis, is something that is both a bit more advanced and also something that you will do sufficiently if you have chosen the right case. For example, if you have chosen the right case that will probably win the debate or win the clash, and you know the strategy of how to win the debate or the clash with the right case, then you're probably going to give some analysis on it. I am fully confident that all of you know how to do analysis. So the second part of this workshop is a bit not as important as the other. So I would just say the most important thing to take away from it. And then we'll go to Q&A. And then in the future, I swear I will do a prolonged workshop on the second part of this. But again, that's why I have started with the first one, because it's just comparatively more important. Yes, but I am sure about different type of analysis. That's okay. Now, burden identification. Why are we talking about burden identification in strategy? Because not all burdens that you're going to have to prove are with equal value, equal strategic value. For example, most often they're not, proving that the status quo is shit and that the status quo has a lot of problems is not the most valuable burden that you need to give within an argument. Probably the most valuable burden that you need to give within an argument is the burden on change, how specifically under this motion the status quo changes. So within arguments, it's most important to identify which is the burden you need to prove for the argument to stand. And the other burdens, I'm not saying that you should not say them. You should probably have some explanation as to why problems exist. So, your impact is amplified if you prove change. But it's comparatively more important to focus your time and resources within prep to think of good reasons on change as opposed to good reasons for problems. Because the change burden that you're going to have as to why something changes from A to B is comparatively more important to proving your argument. And it's comparatively more unique to the motion. And strategy is also the ability to say non-stock analysis that is kind of more tied to the motion. What do I mean by this? If we have the motion, this house would ban users from selling data to companies in exchange for financial returns. If the argument that you are to run from proposition is that with this information sold, certain companies can win elections, there are a couple of burdens that you need to meet, right? You need to firstly say as to why companies, a lot of people will sell their data, which, if you're thinking about it on intuitive check, in order for this motion to have a big delta, it's probably correct. So you don't need to spend a lot of time on it. The second burden that you need to prove is that companies have malicious incentives. We are kind of in the left-wing bubble. Companies probably have malicious incentives with the data that they're using. There is a lot of information as to how companies have been sketchy until now. Meta having a lot of lawsuits on them, the EU trying to regulate them and all of those things. This is also probably something that lies within the intuition of the judge. Not saying that you should not bring it. You should definitely bring it. If you don't, I will tell you in feedback, there was not a lot of plausibility as to why companies have malicious incentives. But it's not the most important burden that you should meet. The most important burden that you should meet is the burden on change. How specifically, if the content is more targeted to individuals with ads, political ads, for example, how is that changing the mind of the voter so they go and cast a vote in a certain way? In another set of words, why is this content going to be comparatively so much more manipulative that it's going to sway elections, that it's actually going to make people go and cast their vote? This is probably the hardest burden to prove because the delta on how much more persuasive those advertisements are going to be is up to debate, and how much people are influenced by advertisement is also up to debate. But this is what changes within the motion, whether they are going to cast their vote or not. This is what you're trying to prove within your impact, that they're going to cast their vote in a certain way, that they're going to sway an election if this is to be the case. So this is the burden that you should focus your most attention on in terms of analysis. And this is again strategic because if you have a proven case that is the right case, as we have explained as to how you should select cases and all of those things, and you have a strategy for this to be the winning case, if you prove this in a strategic way, thus you focus your resources in a strategic way with improving this burden on change, then that's probably comparatively better. Now, since it's 32, we will take like 10 minutes on Q&As because I can imagine there are a lot. Again, this is the most important thing to take out of burdens. We can also try to have a workshopping activity on it to try to identify which is the most important burden. Do you want to do that? And then have questions for other general things?
The sounds great.
Didn't hear, sorry.
I would be for the exercise thing.
Okay. What do you mean by the alternative? In what sense? What do I mean by the alternative? Can you say the sentence so I can know? Alternative, I mean comparative generally when I'm speaking. When I'm saying why isn't this happening alternatively, I am saying why isn't this happening on the comparative? This is kind of what I mean.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Okay, then a workshop. Again, there are other slides with more information upon them. Ignore them. They're less important than what we're doing. I'm just going to click on the other side to see what type of motion I have brought so we can do a workshop on. Okay. If we have, it's actually workshopping. I am so smart to have put this in the slide. This house believes that developing countries should privatize their state-owned enterprises. If we are proposition and the argument that we are running is this will improve services, let's first identify what are the burdens to proving this argument. What are the logical steps to it?
Maybe one part of it would be to prove that the services are still affordable and accessible to people.
Yes, you're not going about it chronologically though, but this is a burden. Why they would be accessible. This is more so a defensive burden, might I add, because you would say this as a burden if you know that the opposition is going to run that those services are going to become very expensive and thus inaccessible. I'm not saying this is not a burden. This is still a burden. It's just a defensive one, and it's not proving the impact, which is improving services. It's just kind of trying to protect the argument from the alternative argument that can come.
I would say that the state-owned enterprises have more capacity to do this. Why they have the capacity and incentive? Money maybe.
But we are talking on prop, and on prop you are supporting privatization and not nationalization.
Oh, then why the privatization has more capacity than the state?
Okay, so about private companies, we need to prove their capacity for better services. From the chat, I can say states have bad incentive and capacity. Yes, we also, if we're going about it in chronological order, we firstly need to prove that there is a necessity for this argument to exist, which is proving the problem. Problem, in the status quo, the services are not great. The trains are shit. They are going to break down any minute now. They have awful bathrooms, and I am speaking from experience in Bulgaria. And I think if you have been to Black Sea Odyssey, you will know. This is like the first burden that I need to prove. And the general claim is that the services currently are shit. Probably the ways in which I have to prove it is firstly proving that the states have bad incentive, and secondly, that they don't have the capacity to improve this. So within this burden, and within any burden, you always need to prove incentive and ability, or capacity, or however you call it. Then again, as Piotr has said in the chat, the second burden is on change. Why companies have comparatively better incentive and capacity, and I think somebody also said it audibly. You need to prove that private companies have the ability to make the services better. But again, with every burden, you need to always prove incentive and ability because that makes it a full proven thing. I will give an intuition pump as to why you always need for every single burden to prove incentive and ability. If I want to build a skyscraper, I don't personally have the money, even though I have the enormous incentive to build it. I like have this enormous desire. I will never build it because I don't have the money. But on the contrary, if I have the money, but I don't have this enormous desire, I will not build a skyscraper. So it's always about those two things working together. And within every burden, you should always prove both incentive and ability. So we have two burdens, which is why the state is shit, why private companies are better. And again, within them, we need to prove incentive and ability. If we want to be kind of strategic and protect our argument from like arguments from the opposition side, we also can go the way on proving as to why private companies will also have an incentive to keep their prices low and for those services to be accessible. This is also a burden that we can prove within the argument. It is not a necessary burden for the argument to function, but it is a nice strategic addition in order to like kind of fight off the opposition. How better can these services be and how much can they potentially improve from this policy? This is interesting because this can be proven within the burdens on why is the service currently shit and why it will be comparatively better in the future. But this is more so about the scale, how shit it is and how much are we going to improve it. And this is definitely something that if you can allocate the time on proving, it would be great because then the delta within the debate is bigger. But this is not necessarily a necessity for the argument. What would be the tipping point burden here? There is no tipping point burden. Tipping point burdens exist only kind of in motions that are about larger things and you're changing one small thing within the motion. This is why a lot of social movements motions always need to have like a tipping point burden because you're only focusing on one of the agendas that the social movement has and it's not the whole agenda that it has. So that's why you always need to prove a tipping point with social movement motions because they are only focusing on one tiny part of the big thing. This sounded very unclear. I am going to give an example for it. If the motion is this house will implement strict state secularism within Western democracies, which is about not having public displays of religion at all within the West. If that is the motion, then probably you need, if you are to run the argument about backlash, you need to run the tipping point as to why strict state secularism is the tipping point for backlash, because this is one specific policy of the whole problem, which is about religion and how religious people, for example, are oppressed or are not oppressed. And it's one specific policy for this whole problem. That's why a tipping point needs to be proved, because there are a lot of other things that are happening simultaneously with this one specific agenda or issue. And that's why it needs to be explained as to why this will be a tipping point. So within like very straightforward policy motions, there is no tipping point. It's just, here is the problem. Here is how we solve it. Yeah. Why did I give this as an example? I will read the slightly off-topic question in a second. because here I think you can identify that the change burden is about how private companies are going to be better. So you probably need to allocate most of your resources, not proving as to why the government is shit. I think most people are going to presume that the government is shit. Most people have experience with bad train lines and all of those things. So you need to allocate time in making your argumentation as to why private companies are going to be comparatively better, stronger. And again, here is where somebody said we also need to explain as to why private companies are going to still make it accessible. This can be a part of the burden in order for this burden to be strategic. So your analysis stays more even after rebuttal for probably the winning argument within the motion. Yes. Now I will read the comment that I did not read a second ago, and then we will have questions. Slightly off topic, but is it allowed to frame that those state-owned enterprises can only be sold to local entities to avoid arguments on foreign control and state services? You are allowed to frame this, but you do not have the model power to say that it's going to be like this. What do I mean? You need to say, okay, this is likely to be sold to local entities. Here are the reasons as to why it's likely to be sold to them. If the motion is with this house who will, then you probably can model it out and it's probably fair. But when it's this house believes that, you probably need to give likelihood incentives as to why it's likely to be sold to local entities as opposed to foreign entities. I here want to flag something. This is not necessarily the most strategic argument that you can make and the most strategic framing that you can make. And there is a reason as to why I have not talked about framing within this workshop. Framing can like lock out certain arguments that you can think of in prep for the other side, or it can like mitigate them to a certain extent. But you first need to notice that it trades off with the time and energy you can spend on proving your argument. And again, strategy is about arguments. It's about identifying the winning argument and knowing how this argument wins. Framing could be a useful tool, but it sometimes can fool you. Why it can fool you? Because if you frame that this is going to be likely sold to local entities on opposition, and this is something that I have personally done at Vienna 2022, I think, from closing opposition I run, this is likely to be sold to very corrupt individuals locally, because this transaction is going to happen in a very corrupt way. And you, with this frame, have allowed this argument to even be more intuitive because you have already provided the reasons as to why it's going to be sold locally. I just now need to prove that those people will be comparatively more corrupt and comparatively more unaccountable than the government is. And then I kind of flip this frame. And with this is why it's also important to think about the method of this motion. What is the process in which this motion is actually implemented, to think about the arguments? Because if I think about the process and I ask myself, okay, how is this transaction going to look like in the moment that I am prepping this motion? I can probably think that this is an argument that opposition is going to run. And then this is probably something to think about when I'm doing arguments. So does this will improve services argument only have two main burdens? Yes, but within those two main burdens, you have also two sub-burdens that you need to prove that are on ability and incentive. But I think most arguments always have those two sub-burdens. Okay, I have yapped for a long time. Do you have any more questions?
Can I ask something on the previous thing you said? On weighted motions, assuming you're closing, are you mentally preparing for verticals to win the winnable class on your side of the house? Or are you also trying to scam the judge and, flip the non-winnable class, or like significantly mitigate and outweigh? I don't know.
Yes, so I think you can do both of those things. And I also, I have presented this in a more simplistic way that it is actually. Most motions with most CA panels are not only going to have two clashes, they're probably going to have 3-4 clashes, meaning that they're probably going to be in weighted motions, 2 clashes that are waiting to probe, 2 clashes that are weighing to op. So you will probably have a clash that is not talked about in debate, or it's not that analyzed, that you can have an argument that it's intuitively winning this clash, even though I only showed like there are 2 clashes. This is the first thing. The second thing, some motion, and I think I already mentioned this because of a question, have a mix of those clashes. There is one clash that is symmetric, and then there are two weighted clashes. And sometimes openings do not take the symmetric clash, or they do not take the weight clash, and you can have those as an extension. But in situations where none of those two things are true, then you can go to vertical extensions. Always very helpful. I love making analysis extension. I think most opening things miss something, or in the process of top half happening, there is a clash that is unresolved that I can resolve with rebuttal, weighing, whatever. Or secondly, I think it's also a great idea to actually run an unintuitive argument and kind of get away with it. Not that it will. It's more easy to get away with an unintuitive argument from closing because you have less speeches to respond to you. But I also don't think that they're inherently losing the debate, insofar as if you're able to actually prove a flip of the argument, then probably you have a very good stance in winning. So that was my answer. Any general tips on how to come up with tipping point reasons, or how to frame that specific analysis is reaching a tipping point? This is probably a question that requires a bit of a more lengthy answer. And since Matt is doing tomorrow a workshop on analysis, this is probably a question to go for Matt. But in general, how to come up with tipping point analysis is, I think if you think about it, if you allocate more time in prep to think about specifically this one burden, and I think it's very useful if you have identified this one burden is the most important burden within the debate. So you have, like, as opposed to 2 minutes to think of reasons for that, 5 minutes. I think that is always helpful. But the second thing is just depends on what you're saying, right? If the motion is about strict state secularism and you're on the side of opposition and you're trying to say that this is a tipping point for people to backlash, then the tipping point needs to be connected with the motion, right? Why specifically secularism is going to make people so mad. And if it's about something like this, probably it's good to talk about people's dignity and how they have associated, for example, religion with their dignity, and why when they public expression of this religion is specifically associated with their dignity. And then you can probably prove a tipping point. The kind of hard thing about tipping points, but it's also if you try to allocate a lot of resources and a lot of time in thinking about it, is just trying to come up with something that's so specific to the motion. Talking about specifically secularism and talking about specifically secularism within public. And if you connect this tipping point analysis to those two things, then it's probably going to be a valid tipping point analysis. Currently, I don't have anything more on that. But again, I think it's a broader section that I probably need to spend a lot of time talking about in order to answer. Is incentive capacity ability always a subburden that we should think about, no matter the arguments that we are running? Or is it more specific to the example of policy debates? Depends. Sometimes one of those two categories, either incentive or ability, is very obviously met from the motion. Sometimes it is not. This is an intuition that I think most of you will have. But it's always a good reminder to have in the back of your head, okay, should I prove both incentive and ability? Because sometimes, because you're not thinking about it, you will forget that this is a thing. It's better to overprove than to underprove. For example, if the motion is this house will abolish the minimum wage, on the side of which you are trying to prove that companies will have more hiring capacity, the ability part of this is covered by the motion. Companies will have more capacity because there is no minimum wage. They will have more money because they do not need to pay more money to workers that are probably doing not that much of a work. So here the ability is met by the motion. But incentive of companies to hire more people is probably the burden that you should focus more on. And I think that's intuitive when you see the motion, and sometimes you're like, okay, this burden is met by the motion, so I should focus more on the other one. But it's always a good question to ask, okay, should I prove both incentive and ability? And kind of not to forget about it. Yeah. I assume that we have no more motions. As Part told me that I could do, we are 5 minutes overtime. I hope this was helpful. I will share my slides again with the caveat that there are more slides that you have not seen. You can ask me questions about them. Probably. Yes. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you.